I'm going to work in chronological order, so I'm going to start with Erez, and essentially each person is going to just say their piece, the key, I suppose you could say, findings, and then with any luck there will be an opportunity for a few more questions or observations at the end of proceedings, and indeed it would be a particularly good opportunity for anyone who hasn't said very much or hasn't said anything or feels he or she hasn't said his or her piece to get it in here. But Erez, if you'd like to...
I think the discussion that we had about big data this morning centered on 4 different primary issues. One are, what are the basic big data resources that we're taking advantage of? Very often for a setting like this, we're thinking about texts, but where are we getting those texts? Who's writing those texts? Are they written over time? What social registers do they reflect? What geographic mixture do they reflect? What genre mixture do they reflect? Second sort of question was, very often these texts are living at companies, so we need to get them from the companies. Sometimes the companies are happy to share. Very often they're not happy to share. The question is, can we translate some of these into forms that companies will share, such as tables of n-grams and their frequencies over time, and make those data public so that they become shared resources for the community rather than these things that are sort of cloistered off inside the, on a server of a company and not being widely used. And the third issue is, once you've got these private and public data sets, you want to start creating interfaces that open them up to the general community so that you do not have to be a hacker to use them. So developing interfaces is an important issue. I think there's a great discussion about, for instance, some of the interfaces over the Google Books Ngram corpus, the original interface. Mark Davies has recently contributed an additional new interface to it. And just the ways in which new interfaces, multiple interfaces of the same data sets can expose different ways of looking at the data and can make aspects of the data available to a much wider public than it would otherwise be. But also some of the issues in terms of how do you accurately document that stuff, how do you make sure that people know what they're getting, et cetera. And the last issue is, to some extent, all of this is assumed that doing something with data and lexicography is a good idea. And in fact, that is far from a foregone conclusion. There are some big questions in terms of what are the big motivators. And I think when it comes to the big motivators, the sort of why, the kinds of analysis that we want to be able to do, the kinds of things that we want to be able to see, I think it breaks down into a couple of different types of issues. One is just making it possible to do the same kind of lexicographic work that has been done for centuries, but to do it better. So how do we identify new words more effectively? How do we identify new senses more effectively? How do we identify new examples and earlier examples more effectively? And that, to some extent, lives in this domain of the dictionary as a list of words coupled with their meanings as a précis of an entire language. There's another aspect of this discussion, which is, well, how can we go beyond the initial mission of the dictionary? To some extent, you could still think about that on the level of an entry. For instance, you can say, well, can we do a much, much better job with our entries in terms of specifying the social register or the geographic distribution of the use of this particular term? You can also think about it from the standpoint not of an individual word, but of the language as a whole. How has the language been changing? If 50,000 new words have entered the language over the past decade, how are those words distributed over intellectual space? Is there an eruption of new words in some particular region of the language that we might want to know about and that our readers might want to know about, or our surfers might want to know about, because it reflects a great deal of intellectual ferment? And I think that those, in some sense, are the least technical questions, but some of the most important questions, because they really get at what the value proposition is of big data for lexicography in general.
So that was Erez speaking. I didn't say at the outset, but the session was called How Can Big Data Best Be Exploited for OED? Now let's just hear a little bit about the session. What should the limits of OED's coverage be, from Stefan?
Thanks very much. So I'll see there should be some slides. One slide, thank you. Yes, that's it, okay. So those are the 4 bullet points from our session. But before I go to that, I just want to thank OUP for bringing us here yesterday when I came in late. on the bus. I felt a little bit like Harry Potter going to Hogwarts, and this anticipation going to this old city of scholars was more than met and surpassed. So thanks so much. But now to the nitty-gritty of our sessions. The limits of coverage, if it's a dictionary of everything in English, where does it end? Well, you include it all. I think that would be one way of summarizing it. But the big juggernaut was, I think, the discussion about world Englishes and English as a lingua franca, and those are not the same. English as a lingua franca is one variety of world Englishes. And I think not everybody agreed on the panel, but I think that's the big game changer. That is now a big fork in the road for Oxford University Press and the OED. There are a number of ways to go about this. You could just say, okay, let's make it the British dictionary and a little bit of subsidiary varieties on the side. Like, it's one way of doing it, and there's a lot of internal variation in British English to do this, but there was the opinion in the audience that that's not a good idea because the OED has always strived to be international. So if you tackle international English, world Englishes, then you got to do it the right way or not at all. And I think if you do it the right way, then there are maybe two ways to go about this. The first is describing the inner circle varieties of English. So the, under inverted commas, white Englishes of the former colonies, like, you know, I mean the UK, then the US, then Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa is a sort of a borderline case there. That would be all right, but I think it'd be disappointing later on down the road. So if you tackle world Englishes head first, then there's one pitfall to make to distinguish between outer circle varieties and expanding circle varieties. So outer circle varieties, the former colonies of Britain, like England and Pakistan, and the expanding circle, you know, Germany and the Euro and China and Russia, those countries that haven't had historical ties with England. So this is Raj Kachu's circle model that Danica presented to us this morning. So the big pitfall would be, I think, if you try to divvy apart the outer circle from the expanding circle. If you tackle world Englishes in the OED, you've got to do them all. And this would include Euro-English and accented English, just like I speak it now, because English is just as much my language as it is John Simpson's language, or just, you know. So the native, non-native speaker distinction needs to be tackled, and there's literature out there. It's no secret. And the battle's been fought in the field. The Quirk-Kachu debate from the mid-80s to the early 90s. It's clear what's the logical choice, but it's a choice that the OED has to make if they want to tackle that. There's been a lot of talk about slang, but I think it can be couched as a spoken language. So what to do with the vernaculars? How would you document that? Audio files, that kind of things. There are workarounds there. Again, it depends on the resources. And the next point will be the labeling practices. Should slang be used as a label or not? Now, what is slang? Is it a term that people confuse? Different people mean different things by it. So Jonathan Green this morning, one of the experts in slang, said something along the lines of, well, he's not quite sure if we should keep it as such. So that's something that'd be interesting to pursue. Whatever you call it, whether informal cloaking or an array of Neo-Latin terms that you make up for the purpose, that's something to consider. Along the same lines, new regional labels have been discussed. If you deal with world Englishes, it's not just enough to say, okay, boondock from Filipino English is US slang for somewhere in the outer periphery of the country or so, because it's also used in Canada, so you should call it North American probably, or if you want to drill down deeper than the regions in those countries, it's probably not slang anymore. So those kind of issues. And there are methodologies where the digital IT resources we have can help us to do this. In Canada, for the dictionary of Canadianisms on historical principles, where we have a big country, second largest landmass, we had to do this with our regionalisms. What's an Ontarianism, what's a BC term, and so on. So there are ways to do this. Specialized vocabulary was the last point. English for specific purposes whether law or sciences or whatnot, huge field should be tackled too. So in a nutshell, you should do it all. As Richard Charkin said in the other session where I sneaked out before, just do it, and OUP owes it to the university and the world. And I guess you have to prioritize. If you ask me what to do first, the first point, well, English is as lingua franca. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan. After lunch, one of the two parallel sessions was on the question, what is the place of OED in education and public life? And Linda is going to address that.
Yeah, it was an interesting session and very wide-ranging, and it managed to generate lots of ideas, and I think came together quite well, actually. Key issues that were prevalent, in fact, across the whole day were access, and the digital maybe is the key word for OED in the 21st century, and particularly availability and transparency. Those were the kind of key words that kept coming up again and again in our session. In particular, there was a real engagement with the idea of getting OED into education and educational practice at all levels, and particularly ways of getting children and both particularly in secondary education to engage with the idea of historical narratives of words about change as a natural part of English language, to maybe preempt some of the bias and prejudice that tends to cluster around reporting of semantic change or lexical change in popular discussion. So the idea of maybe, through examples that Julie and Tim brought to the table, of integrating this discussion at a very early stage so that you end up with informed communities of practice, not just in school, but actually after they've left school, that they become and carry on to be informed users of dictionaries. One of the things that we talked about quite a bit was this idea of the problem of what we might term lexicographical literacy, the ability to we all know OED is out there, but how do people actually use it? What do they read into it? Can they read a dictionary entry effectively? So creating a kind of informed public discourse around dictionaries was one of the kind of blue sky ideas which was discussed quite a bit, particularly about how could we improve real understanding of the OED in past and present, so not just seeing it as a historical dictionary, but as something that's documenting ongoing history, living history in words, in both education and public life. So, and that generated some very interesting discussion. We also looked in particular at while OED is high brand recognition, it's not necessarily always fully understood for what it is, actually. So the problems in current public prominence of the OED, whereby descriptive information can be filtered through a kind of quasi-prescriptive lens again and again. So this is, again, going back to this idea of creating informed communities of practice. We also looked at the, a really good area of discussion was about not just availability of the OED, but what types of data from the OED should be made more widely available. What are the big question was, what are the limits of extending availability of OED, both data and metadata, and what could people do with this actually? So creating a real public engagement in very kind of micro terms as well, and that seemed to be a very exciting area. And a further point was obviously about the nature of keywords. What is not only the OED as a kind of keyword, but also what are the keywords of the 21st century for the OED, and also the complexity of historical and cultural formation in instituting both keywords in Raymond Williams terms, but also in understanding keywords as they're developed in the OED. And we also ventured into territories of the problematic territories of semantics and thinking about the ways in which meaning in English should perhaps, in the OED, should be made to engage more productively, maybe with other languages, particularly other European languages, bearing in mind the cross-fertilization of meaning across spectra of language families. So there are a lot of areas that came out. Fundamental to this, though, was the idea of education as creating this informed base of use, and the really exciting ways in which I think education could be used as a, we think of OED as often as being quite difficult or challenging, but this idea about narratives of life histories of words that can be presented to school children, and that they can start to interrogate data. Actually, and there's some really interesting things going on at the minute in secondary education. So, and lots of potential with GO's reforms actually to maybe create a more informed basis. I'm being optimistic about the current changes in GCSE, but maybe we should kind of engage with change and institute OED at the heart of it.
Thank you, Linda. The session that ran in parallel with that explored the question, what is OED's place in an interlinked world of digital humanities? And Istos can speak about that.
Yes, thank you. First to say that we actually started to address the question towards the very end of the session. So we spend a lot of the time discussing the integration of the historical thesaurus with the OED, and Mark was first speaking about sort of the new approaches that brings to the OED data. Now, first of all, the suggestion was to abandon the alphabetical order altogether, and I think there was quite an agreement about it. And a more interesting aspect was to start thinking about how to visualize the data in new ways, more innovative ways, and we got an example of that, and based on the data in the thesaurus and in the OED. Now, another point that was made was that, there should be semantic tagging of the resources, of meanings in the OED resources, and as well as to facilitate automatic extraction of examples for the OED. So these are the new ways that were suggested to explore the OED data. And one of the most discussed points was to include more encyclopedic data in the OED. And this was sort of also connected with one of the first sessions, so the topics were overlapping quite a lot. And on the top of that is the multilingual gap that currently exists. It was envisaged that the OED could contribute to filling the gap. Several suggestions was made by Janine based on the experience with the Dutch dictionary on how this gap could be filled, including the suggestions of linking the word forms that are currently in the OED with multilingual data. There was also a point made about including more audio material in the OED, and from what I gather from the discussions I have had with members of the OED team, that project is currently being put in motion, so we didn't touch more on that. The final thing that was pointed out was that care should be taken when any new information is presented to the users to make them aware of its reliability. So, for example, we mentioned the contribution, the recent paper, I think it hasn't been published yet, by Charlotte Brewer, who pointed out the problem for the researchers who are not able to access the OED2 data through the online website anymore. So you cannot see the changes made in the definitions and so forth. And think it was David Crystal that made the point that any changes should be archived, so that such things can be changed at any point by any research in the future.
Thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Ursula about the really quite recent session, how best to grapple with words and meanings in OED.
Okay, basically the idea was that it's obviously crucial what the definitions are in the OED, because what do we use the OED for? Users access, if they are not linguists, basically, they access the OED to understand texts and not to understand words. So the crucial idea is, or task is, that you have easy and reliable access to the meaning of a text, so that you understand the text. And so much of the discussion was going on about, do words have meanings in isolation, or can they only be construed in contexts? And there was wide agreement on that, that it's based, the context or the contextualized meanings are important, and it's also been acknowledged that much has been done in the OED in that respect, because there have always been quotations, and so you have always been provided with a context. So this is not particularly new to the OED, but it's probably just as a kind of support here. Another aspect was whether there is a difference between technical terms such as larynx and non-technical words, or also high-frequent words such as to run or to blow, and how to deal or how to conceptualize these meanings differently. So, or whether all kinds of words are similar in them, kind of designations or meanings, so that the difference between technical terms and high-frequent terms is actually as blurred as to be meaningless. The other point mentioned in context with easy access was that if the OED should really present or record every meaning of everything, so what do you do, especially for contemporary English? I mean, this is a question, and how do you present the data, how do you visualize it, and actually how do you go about to make it or to keep it or easily accessible? And I think the most important factor is what has been called the human factor in there. So it has been said, even by people who are big data people, so to say, that for historical data, it's absolutely important to have experts on the language, and that you need, obviously, all or as many quotations as possible, because you do not have the native speaker competence for these earlier periods. And I think as to the human factor, it has also to be pointed out that we are immensely grateful to the human factor in the staff of the OED for providing us with such a reliable, accessible, and wonderful tool. So without you, obviously, all the big data and automated retrieval doesn't make a dictionary in the end.
Thank you, Ursula. And finally, we're going to hear from Richard Charkin about the session which went under the title, Can We Predict the Future Shape of Electronic Dictionaries?
I'm not sure if all the participants would agree, but I concluded that we cannot predict the future shape of dictionaries. What we might be able to do, if we're lucky, is to reduce the chances of getting it entirely wrong and increase the chances of doing something right. We need a lot, I believe, and I think this was said, I believe we need a lot more research into how people use the dictionaries. We now have the tools not just to distribute, but to learn. If you think about it, we've never really known why people buy dictionaries. We don't know how many. We put them in bookshops and they disappear, or not. Now we can measure. And there's all sorts of technologies available to us to measure, see how people behave, see how we can respond. One of the issues, and it's come out from nearly everywhere, is this question of how much to do, how many variants of English, you know, because it's huge, it could be anything. And I have to say that I think most of us were saying, in one way or another, that the best is the enemy of the good. And we do have to sometimes accept imperfection. And imperfection is important because perfection is probably impossible. So it is better to do something imperfectly than to do nothing. And in the case of the OED, we have to be incredibly careful that we don't lose its uniqueness. And by that, I don't mean fear of brand stuff, but what Jim was saying, and I agreed with him, that we could add millions of words a day, and millions of words come over the Twitter sphere. We could, you know, do all sorts of things, but then it wouldn't be the OED. The OED has a certain stand-backishness, a certain aloofness, and whilst obviously we need to engage with as many people as possible, let's lose that. I don't know, it's almost old-fashioned. I'm chairman of a thing called Wisden Cricketer's Almanac, which is the most old-fashioned thing in the universe. And it works because it retains that little bit of something. And I think we all felt that whatever the future shape of dictionaries is, the OED, A, is going to be central, and B, needs to maintain its standards, which aren't always perfect, but attempting to be perfect or nearly perfect. And of course, it goes without saying that hand in hand with the lexicographical expertise, we need the technological expertise to capture whatever's going on out there, either to publish it or to find out what people want. I found it an extraordinarily helpful session.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I mean, that's an apposite moment, I think, to invite people not to be stand-backish, but to exploit the remaining 10 minutes that we have to say all those things that have not been said so far, preferably in as few words as possible. So, fire away. Laura.
Thank you. I totally agree with the last speaker, and can I just in some very short words say etymology is hugely important because the etymological scholarship of the OED is tremendous. To maintain it, and could I put in a plea for scholarship or keeping up with scholarship on dividing your French from your continental French origins? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, well.
Just a quick comment. Today, I've heard several people referring to the OED as a historical dictionary. I find that rather strange, because to me, a historical dictionary would be a dictionary of Middle English or Old English or early modern English. But to me, the OED is, if a language is like a person, the OED is like its CV. If the person is dead, then the CV stops somewhere, sometime. Then that's a historical person, and the CV is historical. But the English language is still alive, and the OED is still alive. So how can we say it's a historical dictionary? It's a dictionary based on historical principles. Now, maybe to some people, when they open the OED, they see a lot of old usages, old meanings, definitions, and so on. That may be of great interest to a few experts, but I think to most people, they are more interested in the latest meaning. And for that purpose, I think maybe we can ask the technology people to make it possible for people to see the different senses and definitions either chronologically or counter-chronologically, starting from the most recent meaning first.
I've been interested in the discussion of expanding the usership of the OED, but I've found it very vague in terms of who those users should be, who the target should be. And for me, one of the big challenges in lexicography today has to be that there's been a shift from the use of the dictionary for reading to the use of the dictionary for writing, a lot of the suggestions I've heard about the OED today do sound like they're more aimed toward a productive user role for the OED. I'm not sure that's where the OED should go, though. And someone in the last panel about words and meanings said the ultimate, you know, the paramount concern should be the reader. And I think that sort of historically has been what the OED is, and that maybe there are different sources for productive users.
I don't know if anyone wants to speak in direct response to any of this, or whether we're just having a sort of question maelstrom. But Tim Shaw's is at the back.
Can I just slightly respond?
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's a response to everything really, but the only reason that smaller dictionaries were smaller than the OED was because the cost of paper and print and postage made it economically the only way to do it. And I, at the beginning of this project, I remember saying, well, why wouldn't someone want the OED? You may not use it all, you know, you may only look it up for spelling, all right, fine, but why wouldn't you have the OED?
Well, it's also ease of use,
yeah,
right? And
okay.
that's still something that's very relevant today.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what is not online doesn't exist.
Exactly.
So it's hard to believe for historical linguists, but it's true.
Yep.
More and more so.
Tim at the back.
I was just going to say that in terms of readership, we're probably responsible for some of these claims that the OED could have a wider reader base and for the vagueness about that. I think we're thinking about reading, about the OED being read as some kind of reflexive commentary on language and society. We weren't certainly thinking of writing. Just the thing about this readership, and one of the things that hasn't been talked about today is money. And you know, for some years, OED has been free in the UK with a free public library membership. My sense, I'd be interested to know from many of the kind of OED staffers here what's known about the level of uptake. I've heard something about family histories being one area where people have taken advantage of it. But my general sense is that it's not well known about, and there's been the potential for a much wider readership without the barrier of money, but it actually hasn't happened. And perhaps I welcome some comment on that from the people who know what's happened there.
I'm not sure those people are sitting up here. I think they're sitting down there.
Thanks, Tim. I think that's a really, really good point, because one of the things that we've been trying to do is to increase that usage through the public libraries, and it hasn't, the take-up hasn't been as high as it could be, and that's true. On the other hand, there are lots of nice anecdotes of people who've discovered it and are using it. Part of our question, our difficulty, I guess, is that each time we're dealing with lots and lots and lots and lots of individual libraries who all have to take up and do their own their own sort of research, their own marketing and so on. But absolutely, we would like more people to be using the OED through their public library systems. That's been that's a deal that we did with the Arts Council, that we just renewed with the Arts Council just last year. So it's fundamental to our access mission.
5:30 is fast approaching. We probably have time for a couple more succinct. Yes, Helen.
I will try to be succinct. It's Helen Beetham, and I've been trying to work out why I was invited, but it may be something to do with having expertise in open source software and open content of various kinds. And in my world, it would be impossible to imagine a discussion about the future of such a major resource, a major public resource and research project, without a hashtag, without live tweeting, without live streaming, without the walls of this room being broken down, and people who hadn't been invited being sort of brought into that conversation. And I guess my experience would be to say say that there are ways in which the OED could be more radically open, not just in the outcomes of its scholarship, but in the processes of its scholarship, the raw materials, the raw data, the tools that are used, and the discussions that go on in rooms like this. And I don't know of any major public knowledge resource. I could think of the human genome as an example that was made worse by open scrutiny by other scholars of those processes. Now, I hear a great deal being said about the ways in which the OED is being made more accessible in its outcomes, and fully appreciate that as a user. But I do think that if it wants to be at the centre of a discussion about our language as a resource for English-speaking societies and cultures, the future as well as the history of that language, there need to be a lot more sophisticated models of what it means to be open as a public resource, how the public expects to be able to interact with an open resource, how they expect it to be interoperable with other services that they use and other scholarly activities they engage with, than perhaps has been summarised entirely today.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to amplify that. I mean, I think the OED did not get to its premier place among dictionaries via, some of these sorts of, aloofness type strategies. I think it got there by bold communal outreach. And the OED is no longer at the forefront of bold communal outreach in the creation of reference works. And I think that's something that folks ought to think about, right? There's a value for high standards, but there's a deep tradition here of bravery in crowdsourcing.
Can I just mild correction? It got to its position because it got finished. 1928, it was finished. There are so many unfinished big dictionaries. Finishing was by far the most important thing.
And on that note, our next engagement is something rather more refreshing, some drinks in the Ashmolean at 6:30. I think perhaps all that remains is for a round of applause for all of us who have participated in this really quite special day.
Really heartfelt thank you to all of you for all of your interesting, radical, rude ideas for the OED. I mean, this is what it was all about, really. My head's kind of spinning at the moment from as the publishing side of things, like what happens next, what are we going to do? I know, just in answer to Richard, something will happen. We will do something. I'm not quite sure what it is yet, but I'm sure my colleagues are having similar sorts of thoughts, but I know something will happen as a result of this. And I just want to say thank you again for giving all of your time and your contributions and your engagement and your ideas today. So thanks, and see you at around 6:30 across the road in the Ashmolean for drinks and then dinner. Thank you.
Good job. Yeah.